The morning of September 24th, 1869, gold trading opened on the New York Exchange at $143 per ounce. By noon, it had climbed to $160. By 1:30 in the afternoon, it touched $162, then began falling so rapidly that men on the trading floor stopped shouting and simply stared at the boards. Within 20 minutes, fortunes built over decades had evaporated. Businessmen who had borrowed heavily against anticipated gains found themselves ruined before they could reach their brokers. Some left the exchange and walked directly to the Hudson River. In a private office several blocks away, Jay Gould sat reading the ticker tape with no visible emotion. He had already sold. The panic that day would be remembered as Black Friday, a disaster that nearly collapsed the American economy and destroyed thousands of lives. Investigations would follow, testimony would be given, but the man at the center would face no criminal charges, pay no significant penalty, and emerge wealthier than before. The public would despise him for it. High society would refuse him entry. Editorial cartoons would depict him as a vulture, a spider, a devil. And yet, he would continue, building an empire of railroads and telegraph lines, accumulating power that brought him no peace, no acceptance, and no escape from what he had become. This is not a story about how wealth was built. It is about what that wealth could not buy and what it quietly destroyed instead. Jay Gould was born in 1836 in Roxbury, New York, a settlement too small to appear on most maps. His father ran a failing farm on rocky soil that produced more stones than crops. The family ate sparingly. Clothes were patched until the patches themselves needed patching. By age 10, Gould was working in his father's fields before dawn, attending the local schoolhouse when labor permitted, and returning to chores until darkness made further work impossible. The schoolteacher noticed something. The boy could calculate. While other students struggled with basic arithmetic, Gould solved complex problems in his head, faster than they could be written on the slate. Numbers weren't abstract to him. They were tools, instruments of measurement and prediction. When his father sold grain, young Gould would calculate the profit margin before the transaction completed. He was usually correct. More importantly, he began to notice when others miscalculated, either through incompetence or intentional deception. At 15, he left the farm. There was no dramatic departure, no argument. His father simply had too many children and too little food. Gould found work at a country store, keeping ledgers, managing inventory, and learning how commerce actually functioned beyond the theoretical problems in school books. He observed that business was not governed by fairness or effort, but by information and timing. The merchant who knew crop prices in New York City before his competitors could buy low and sell high. The man who understood which customers would pay and which would default could extend credit strategically. Gould absorbed these lessons without moral commentary. They were simply facts. By 18, he had saved enough to commission a survey map of Ulster County. He had no formal training as a surveyor, but he taught himself from borrowed books and produced work accurate enough to sell. The maps brought in money. More importantly, they brought him into contact with Zadok Pratt, a wealthy tanner who owned operations across the Catskills. Pratt saw potential in the thin, quiet young man who spoke little but calculated constantly. He offered Gould a partnership managing a tannery in Pennsylvania. The tannery failed. The official story involved poor hemlock supply and difficult terrain. The unofficial story, repeated in Pennsylvania for decades afterward, was different. Workers claimed Gould had cut their wages while reporting full costs to Pratt. Suppliers said he had delayed payments, using their money to speculate in leather futures. When the operation collapsed, Pratt lost his investment. Gould walked away with enough capital to start again elsewhere. Pratt never filed legal action. Years later, when asked why, he said only that the courts wouldn't have believed a poor man could outmaneuver a rich one. The comment was bitter, but accurate. Gould had learned something essential. The appearance of legitimate business could mask almost anything, and the burden of proof always fell on the accuser. By age 21, Gould had moved to New York City with a small stake and a reputation that preceded him among those who cared to inquire. He began trading in small railroad stocks, not the prestigious lines that connected major cities, but struggling local routes with unstable ownership. These were stocks most investors avoided. Gould studied them obsessively, learning to read bankruptcy filings, charter provisions, and debt structures the way other men read newspapers. He discovered that a failing railroad could be more valuable than a successful one. A company near collapse could be purchased cheaply, its debts restructured, its assets stripped or consolidated, and its stock price manipulated to profit on both the decline and the eventual rise. It required no innovation, no improvement in service, no benefit to passengers or freight customers. It simply required understanding the mechanics of corporate control and being willing to execute them without hesitation. In 1859, Gould married Helen Day Miller, the daughter of a moderately prosperous merchant. She was quiet, religious, and deeply conventional. Nothing in her correspondence or later accounts suggests she understood what her husband actually did for money. She knew he worked in railroads and finance. She knew they lived comfortably, and then very comfortably. But the specifics of his methods remained opaque to her, and she never inquired too deeply. This may have been deliberate ignorance or simply the expected posture of a wife in that era. Either way, the marriage established a pattern. Gould's domestic life would exist in a separate chamber from his business operations, sealed off and never discussed. They moved into a modest brownstone in Manhattan. Helen attended church regularly. Gould did not, though he sometimes accompanied her for appearances. He had no religious convictions that anyone could identify, but he understood that visible respectability had value. A wife, a home, a superficial participation in social norms, these things provided cover. They suggested stability, normalcy, the kind of life that might distract from questions about how the money was actually made. By 1860, Gould had accumulated enough capital to attempt something larger. He began acquiring shares in the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad, a small line running between Troy and Saratoga Springs. The railroad was poorly managed and hemorrhaging money. Gould didn't fix it. Instead, he used his position as a major shareholder to force a merger with a connecting line, profiting from the consolidation while smaller investors were diluted out. Several of those investors filed complaints. One attempted legal action. The case was dismissed on technical grounds before reaching trial. No one who worked closely with Gould during this period left accounts describing him as cruel or sadistic. They described him as silent, focused, and utterly indifferent to outcomes beyond financial gain. He didn't celebrate victories or lament losses. He simply calculated the next position. This absence of emotional response was perhaps more unsettling than active malice would have been. It suggested a mind that processed people and companies as interchangeable variables in equations that only he could see. By the mid-1860s, Gould had become a recognized presence in New York financial circles, though not a welcomed one. Men did business with him when necessary, but excluded him from social gatherings. Invitations to dinners, clubs, and private events went to rivals with half his capital. He noticed. Helen noticed too, though she mentioned it only in a single surviving letter to her sister, writing that New York society is smaller than one might expect. The understatement was characteristic. They were being rejected systematically and deliberately, and the rejection had nothing to do with wealth. Gould had money. What he lacked was the veneer of legitimacy that older fortunes had carefully constructed. His methods were too recent, too visible, too obviously predatory. It didn't slow him down. If anything, the exclusion clarified his position. He would never be accepted, so he stopped seeking acceptance. Instead, he began planning something considerably larger. The Erie Railroad stretched from New York City to Lake Erie, carrying freight and passengers across 500 miles of track through some of the most valuable commercial territory in America. By 1867, it was also nearly bankrupt, its rails in disrepair, its management incompetent, and its stock price depressed. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who already controlled the New York Central Railroad, wanted it. He began buying Erie shares in volume, intending to gain control and eliminate a competing route. Jay Gould saw the same opportunity from a different angle. He didn't want to run the Erie Railroad efficiently. He wanted to control it long enough to extract maximum value before anyone realized what was happening. In October 1867, Gould purchased a seat on the Erie's board of directors. He aligned himself with Daniel Drew, the railroad's treasurer and a veteran stock manipulator, and Jim Fisk, a former circus promoter who understood spectacle and distraction. Together, they formed a working alliance built on mutual cynicism rather than trust. Drew had been manipulating Erie stock for years through a scheme involving convertible bonds that he would turn into shares and dump on the market, depressing prices before buying back in. Gould studied the mechanism carefully. Then he improved it. When Vanderbilt continued buying Erie shares in early 1868, attempting to accumulate majority control, Gould responded by printing more shares. The Erie Charter contained provisions allowing the railroad to issue convertible bonds, which could then be converted to stock. Gould, Drew, and Fisk began converting bonds at a rate designed to dilute Vanderbilt's position faster than he could buy. For every 1,000 shares Vanderbilt purchased, Gould printed 1,500 more. Vanderbilt secured an injunction. Judge George Barnard of the New York State Supreme Court, who had received campaign contributions from Vanderbilt interests, issued an order forbidding the Erie directors from printing additional stock. Gould responded by obtaining a counter-injunction from Judge Gilded of the same court, who had received payments from Drew. For several weeks, two judges from the same court issued contradictory orders, each backed by legal arguments and each funded by opposing sides. The legal absurdity didn't matter. What mattered was that Gould continued printing shares, while the injunctions tangled in procedural challenges. By March 1868, the Erie had issued over $50 million in new stock, most of it purchased by Vanderbilt, before he understood the scale of the scheme. He had spent approximately $7 million acquiring shares that were worth considerably less, diluted by an artificially expanded supply. When Judge Barnard finally issued arrest warrants for Gould, Drew, and Fisk, they fled across the Hudson River to New Jersey, taking the Erie's corporate books, cash reserves, and printing plates with them. They established operations at Taylor's Hotel in Jersey City, just beyond New York's jurisdiction, and continued managing the railroad from exile. Gould hired armed guards to patrol the building. Fisk characteristically described the situation as Fort Taylor and gave interviews to newspapers treating the entire affair as theater. It wasn't theater to the men who had invested in Erie bonds expecting legitimate returns. It wasn't theater to workers whose wages were delayed while Gould diverted funds to legal fees and bribes. But Gould never addressed these concerns publicly. He remained in Jersey City, meeting with lawyers, calculating positions, and waiting for leverage. The leverage came through Albany. Gould traveled to the state capitol carrying a satchel containing approximately $500,000 in cash. Over a period of weeks, he distributed this money to New York state legislators, securing their support for a bill that would retroactively legalize Erie's stock issuance. The bribes were not subtle. One assemblyman later testified that Gould had approached him directly, offering $15,000 for his vote. Another described Gould's hotel suite as a den of thieves, where legislators lined up for payment. The bill passed. Governor Reuben Fenton, who had received substantial campaign contributions from Erie-connected sources, signed it into law. The stock issuance was now legal. The arrest warrants were dropped. Gould, Drew, and Fisk returned to New York as directors of a railroad they had looted, their positions secured by purchased legislation. Vanderbilt withdrew. He had lost millions attempting to fight an opponent who simply changed the rules through bribery faster than legal challenges could proceed. Years later, when asked about the Erie War, Vanderbilt allegedly said, "Law. What do I care about law? Hain't I got the power?" But Gould had demonstrated something more disturbing. Power could be purchased more cheaply than accumulated, and legal systems were simply another market where outcomes could be bought. The newspapers erupted. Editorial writers called Gould a corrupter, a thief, a public enemy. The New York Times described him as one of the most offensive of all the Wall Street operators. Harper's Weekly published cartoons showing him as a vulture, picking over the railroad's carcass. The coverage was unrelenting, detailed, and utterly ineffective. Gould had broken no laws that were enforceable after his legislative purchases. He had simply exposed how cheaply the law could be altered. Public rage meant nothing without legal consequence, and there was none. The stock manipulation was now retroactively legitimate. The bribery, while widely known, was never prosecuted. The legislators who had accepted payments faced no significant political cost. Some were re-elected. The system had absorbed the scandal and continued operating. Gould remained on the Erie's board for 2 more years, during which the railroad's condition deteriorated further. Maintenance was deferred. Equipment went unrepaired. Freight customers complained about delays and damaged goods. Workers faced wage cuts and dangerous conditions. None of this affected the stock price, which Gould continued to manipulate through coordinated trading and planted newspaper stories. In 1872, he finally sold his Erie position at a profit and walked away. The railroad would limp forward for decades, perpetually undercapitalized and poorly managed, a shell of what it might have been under competent leadership. Thousands of investors had been ruined. Vanderbilt had lost millions. Workers had suffered through years of neglect. But Gould had emerged wealthier, more powerful, and entirely untouchable by legal mechanisms that he had demonstrated could be purchased as easily as railroad stock. Helen gave birth to their first child during this period, a son named George. There is no record of Gould taking time away from the Erie operations for the birth. He was in Albany distributing cash to legislators, while his wife recovered at their brownstone in Manhattan. In the summer of 1869, Gould occupied a peculiar position in American finance. The country was technically on a paper currency system following the Civil War, but gold remained the standard for international trade and debt settlement. The federal government held substantial gold reserves and occasionally sold portions to stabilize the currency. This created an opportunity. If someone could prevent the government from selling while simultaneously driving up demand, they could corner the market and control the price. Gould began accumulating gold quietly in June. He used intermediaries, shell accounts, and carefully timed purchases to avoid detection. By early September, he had acquired approximately $15 million in gold contracts, a position large enough to influence the market, but not large enough to trigger immediate suspicion. The scheme required one additional element: ensuring the federal government wouldn't sell its reserves and flood the market. President Ulysses Grant was approachable, not through direct bribery, which would have been too obvious, but through social manipulation and strategic relationships. Gould cultivated a friendship with Abel Corbin, who had recently married Grant's sister. Through Corbin, Gould gained access to the president during a steamboat journey from New York to Boston in June 1869. During that voyage, Gould explained to Grant why federal gold sales harmed farmers by strengthening the dollar and making American grain more expensive in foreign markets. The argument was technically coherent and wrapped in patriotic language about helping Western agricultural interests. Grant listened but made no commitments. Gould interpreted the lack of refusal as potential consent. What Grant actually believed remains unclear. He was not a sophisticated financial thinker and genuinely may have found Gould's agricultural arguments convincing. Or he may have simply been polite, unwilling to dismiss the brother-in-law's associate during a social gathering. Either way, Gould left the meeting believing he had influenced the president to suspend gold sales. He accelerated his purchases. By mid-September, Gould's position had grown to approximately $40 million in gold contracts. He brought in Jim Fisk, who had helped with the Erie scheme, and Fisk began buying with his characteristic lack of subtlety. Unlike Gould, who worked through quiet intermediaries, Fisk purchased openly and boasted about it. Gold prices began climbing. On September 20th, gold traded at $137 per ounce. By September 22nd, it had reached $141. Other speculators noticed the movement and began buying, amplifying the rise. Men who had no connection to Gould's scheme purchased gold simply because prices were climbing, each one pushing the market higher. This was the critical mechanism. Gould didn't need to buy all the gold himself. He simply needed to trigger enough momentum that others would do the work for him. On September 23rd, Grant began receiving warnings. Treasury Secretary George Boutwell sent word that the gold market appeared manipulated. Businessmen who depended on stable gold prices for international trade wrote letters expressing alarm. Grant, vacationing in Pennsylvania, remained noncommittal. He had still not ordered any federal sales. The morning of September 24th opened with gold at $143. By 11 o'clock, it had reached $155. By noon, $160. The trading floor at the gold exchange descended into chaos. Men screamed bids across the room. Runners carried messages between brokers. Outside, crowds gathered on Broad Street watching the price boards through the windows. Gould was not at the exchange. He sat in his office at the Erie Railroad headquarters, receiving updates by messenger. At some point between noon and 1 o'clock, accounts differ on the exact timing, he began selling. Not publicly, not through the exchange floor, but through private transactions with specific brokers who would execute the sales without immediately reporting them to the market. The critical detail: Gould sold while prices were still rising, while Fisk and others continued buying under the belief that the scheme remained intact. Fisk would later claim he had no knowledge of Gould's sales. Other partners in the scheme said the same. They had been operating on the assumption that Gould would signal before unwinding his position. He had not signaled. At 1:30 p.m., gold touched $162. Then Grant, finally grasping the situation's severity, authorized Boutwell to sell $4 million in government gold. The announcement reached the exchange floor within minutes. Prices collapsed. Men who had purchased gold at $160 expecting it to reach $200 now held contracts worth $140 and falling. Margin calls went out immediately. Brokers who couldn't meet them were ruined before trading ended. The exchange closed early as pandemonium overwhelmed any attempt at orderly business. Some men walked out silently. Others wept. A few sought out the brokers who had sold them gold contracts and threatened violence. At least one broker, overwhelmed by the financial destruction, left the building and never returned home. His family found him 3 days later at the Hudson River docks, incoherent and unable to explain where he had been. Gould had already sold. His profit was approximately $11 million, earned in less than 4 months through a scheme that had nearly collapsed American finance. The men who had followed him into the market, including Fisk, faced catastrophic losses. Legitimate businesses that depended on stable gold prices found their trade positions destroyed. Import-export firms failed. Banks holding gold-backed loans foreclosed on borrowers who could no longer meet the new valuations. Within a week, Congress announced an investigation. Gould was summoned to testify in January 1870. He appeared calm, dressed conservatively, and answered questions with technical precision. Yes, he had purchased gold. No, he had not coordinated with the president. Yes, he had sold before the crash. No, he had not manipulated the market illegally. Speculation was not a crime. The testimony was maddening in its legality. Gould had done nothing explicitly criminal. Cornering a market was not illegal if you claimed to be speculating rather than manipulating. Cultivating relationships with government officials was not bribery if no explicit payment changed hands. Selling while others believed you were still buying was not fraud if you had made no binding promises. The congressmen questioning him understood they were watching someone operate just inside the boundaries of law, but they could find no mechanism to charge him. The investigation produced a report condemning the speculation and recommending new regulations, but no indictments followed. Gould walked out of the hearing room and returned to his office. Helen was pregnant with their second child during Black Friday. In a letter to her sister, she mentioned that Jay had been working unusually long hours and seemed distracted. She did not mention gold or financial markets. She may not have known the specifics, or she may have chosen not to write them down. After Black Friday, invitations stopped arriving. Not that there had been many, but the few social acknowledgments that Helen had received from acquaintances at church or through merchant connections quietly ceased. Women who had previously nodded politely when passing on the street now crossed to the other side. The wife of a textile importer who had occasionally joined Helen for afternoon tea sent a brief note explaining that her husband's business circumstances had changed and she would be unable to continue their visits. Helen understood what this meant. Her husband's name had become toxic in a way that went beyond business rivalry. He wasn't simply a competitor who had outmaneuvered others. He was something worse, something that respectable society needed to quarantine. She never confronted Gould about this directly. In her surviving letters, she maintained the fiction that their social isolation was a matter of preference rather than exclusion, writing to her family that the city's entertainments hold little appeal and that we prefer the quiet comfort of home. Whether she believed this or simply needed to believe it remains unclear. What is certain is that she stopped attempting to establish social connections. She attended church alone. She visited her family in Pennsylvania without Gould. She managed the household and raised their children in a domestic sphere that operated completely separately from his business operations. The division was absolute, maintained by mutual silence about what he actually did for money and what that money had cost them in terms of social position. Gould's response to the isolation was to fortify it. In 1870, he purchased a large brownstone mansion at 578 Fifth Avenue, far grander than their previous residence. The house was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was heavy, dark, built with thick stone walls and minimal ornamentation. The windows were smaller than fashionable architecture of the period typically featured. The entrance was set back from the street, accessed through a gated courtyard that could be secured. The mansion functioned less as a home than as a fortress. Gould installed a private telegraph line connecting directly to his office, allowing him to monitor market movements without leaving the building. He hired security staff who screened visitors before they reached the door. The interior was furnished expensively but without taste. Heavy drapes, dark wood, expensive paintings selected by dealers rather than personal preference. It was the kind of wealth that announced itself through cost rather than aesthetic judgment. Helen attempted to make it comfortable. She selected furniture for the children's rooms, arranged flowers in the main hall, and maintained routines of domestic normalcy. But the house resisted warmth. Its design was defensive, built to keep the world out rather than welcome anyone in. Guests were rare and grew rarer. Business associates occasionally visited for meetings, but these were conducted in Gould's private study and never extended to social dinners or family gatherings. The children, George, Edwin, Helen, Howard, Anna, and Frank, born between 1869 and 1877, grew up in this sealed environment. They had tutors rather than attending school, which Gould justified as providing superior education, but which also prevented them from forming friendships with children whose parents would have forbidden the association. The isolation was total and deliberate. Gould was ensuring that his children would not experience the rejection he faced, but in doing so, he was also ensuring they would not experience much of anything beyond the mansion's walls. In 1873, financial panic swept through New York. The collapse of Jay Cook and Company triggered a cascade of bank failures and a depression that would last for years. Railroads failed, businesses closed, unemployment spread across major cities. Gould weathered the crisis easily. He had positioned himself in cash and gold before the crash, either through prescient analysis or insider knowledge of the bank's vulnerabilities. While others scrambled to survive, he began purchasing distressed railroad assets at collapsed prices. The contrast between his continued accumulation and the widespread suffering did not go unnoticed. Newspapers began running stories about railroad barons and robber kings, with Gould featured prominently. The coverage was not simply critical, but actively hostile. He was described as a vampire, a spider, a predator feeding on the nation's misery. Editorial cartoons depicted him with exaggerated features, thin, dark, lurking in shadows, while honest workers starved. Gould never responded publicly. He gave no interviews, issued no statements, made no attempt to defend his actions or explain his business methods. This silence was often interpreted as contempt, but it may have been something closer to pragmatism. He understood that public opinion could not be changed through argument. The people who hated him would continue hating him regardless of what he said. Engaging would only provide more material for newspapers to distort. Helen's health began deteriorating around this period. The exact nature of her illness was never clearly diagnosed. Medical records from the era are incomplete, but her letters mention persistent fatigue, headaches, and periods of melancholy that kept her bedridden for days. She was 34 years old and had borne 6 children in 8 years. Whether her condition was purely physical or partly psychological, a response to the isolation and strain of her position cannot be determined from the available evidence. Gould hired private physicians, but showed little personal engagement with her illness. He was building a telegraph empire, acquiring Western Union stock through shell companies, and preparing to take control of the nation's communications infrastructure. His working hours extended deep into the night. Helen rarely saw him except at breakfast, and even then he often ate while reading financial reports. In a letter to her sister dated November 1874, Helen wrote, "The house is very quiet now. The children have their lessons, and I have my routines. Jay is occupied with his affairs. We manage well enough. The phrase manage well enough appeared several times in her correspondence from this period, always in the same flat tone, suggesting a life reduced to basic functionality without joy or connection. There were no arguments, no dramatic confrontations. The marriage had settled into a pattern of parallel existence. Gould provided material comfort on a scale that would have been unimaginable during Helen's childhood. She maintained a household and raised children who would never experience poverty. Neither seemed to expect more from the arrangement. Affection, if it had ever existed, had been replaced by a practical division of responsibilities. Social rejection had achieved what it intended. Gould and his family were sealed off from respectable society, isolated in their mansion, removed from the normal mechanisms of community and belonging. But the rejection had also freed him from any remaining pressure to moderate his methods. If he would never be accepted, regardless of how he behaved, there was no incentive to behave differently. In 1874, Western Union controlled roughly 80% of America's telegraph traffic. Messages crossed the country through its wires. Business orders, personal correspondence, news reports, stock prices, weather information, train schedules. The company's reach was comprehensive enough to be essential, but fragmented enough to have competitors. Gould identified this as inefficiency that could be exploited. He began purchasing Western Union stock in small quantities through intermediaries, ensuring no single large transaction would alert the company's board or trigger price increases. The purchases continued for months, accumulating position without visibility. Simultaneously, he invested in smaller telegraph companies, the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, the American Union Telegraph Company, building them up as ostensible competitors to Western Union while maintaining hidden ownership. The strategy had a clear logic. If Gould openly attempted to take over Western Union, the company would resist and the price would spike beyond profitable acquisition. But if Western Union faced aggressive competition that threatened its market dominance, its stock price would decline from investor fear, making acquisition cheaper. Gould was manufacturing the threat he would later solve by consolidating the industry under his control. In 1875, he escalated the competitive pressure. The Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, which Gould controlled through proxy ownership, began slashing rates and undercutting Western Union's prices. The rate war was economically irrational. Neither company could sustain the reduced prices long term, but Gould wasn't trying to build a sustainable competitor. He was trying to panic Western Union's shareholders. It worked. Western Union's stock declined as investors worried about eroding market share. The company's board met repeatedly to discuss the competitive threat, unaware that the threat's ultimate owner was simultaneously purchasing their declining stock. By early 1876, Gould had accumulated enough Western Union shares to demand a board seat. He was granted one, ostensibly as a compromise, to bring peace to the industry. From his position on the board, Gould had access to Western Union's internal operations, customer lists, expansion plans, and financial vulnerabilities. He used this information to further depress the stock price through strategic leaks to newspapers about the company's challenges. Then he purchased more shares at the reduced price. In March 1876, he forced a merger between Western Union and his own Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, consolidating control while presenting the arrangement as a rational business combination rather than a hostile takeover. The merger gave Gould effective control over American telecommunications. Messages now flowed through the infrastructure he dominated. Businesses that depended on telegraphic communication had no alternative provider. News organizations that needed to transmit stories across distances paid rates that Gould's company set. Stock prices, which moved through telegraph wires before appearing on exchange boards, passed through systems he controlled. This created opportunities beyond simple profit from telegraph services. Gould had information before it reached public markets. A message announcing a railroad accident would cross his wires before newspapers received it, allowing him to sell stock in the affected company before the price dropped. A telegram containing crop failure reports would pass through his system before commodity traders knew about it, giving him time to position accordingly. The telegraph monopoly wasn't just a business. It was an intelligence network that provided advanced knowledge of market-moving events. Whether Gould actively exploited this information advantage is difficult to prove from surviving records. He left no written instructions to delay messages or intercept specific communications. But his trading patterns during this period show remarkable prescience about events that were only known through telegraph transmission. He sold railroad stocks days before accidents were publicly reported. He purchased grain futures before weather disasters became news. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Competitors suspected manipulation but could prove nothing. Telegraph messages were private, and Western Union kept no records that would reveal whether specific communications had been delayed or monitored. When questions arose, the company issued statements about its commitment to message security and customer privacy. These statements were technically true in that there was no official policy of interception. What happened unofficially in the space between policy and practice remained invisible. The monopoly made Gould richer but more hated. Newspapers that depended on telegraph services to function published editorials condemning him as a threat to free communication. The New York Sun ran a series of articles describing Western Union as an octopus whose tentacles reach into every corner of commerce. The Chicago Tribune called Gould the most dangerous man in America, arguing that control over communications gave him power that exceeded legitimate business into something closer to state-level authority. Congress held hearings on telegraph monopolization in 1877. Gould was called to testify. He appeared in a dark suit carrying prepared financial statements and answered questions with careful precision. Yes, he controlled Western Union. No, he did not interfere with message transmission. Yes, rates had increased after the merger. No, this was not exploitation, but necessary pricing to maintain service quality. The testimony was legally unassailable, but morally evasive. Gould described the telegraph business in technical language, capitalization rates, infrastructure costs, maintenance requirements, that obscured the fundamental question of whether one man should control the nation's communications network. The congressman grew frustrated with answers that were accurate but unhelpful. One senator asked directly, "Do you believe it is appropriate for you to have this much power?" Gould replied, "I believe I have acted within the law." It was not an answer to the question asked. No legislation resulted from the hearings. The telegraph monopoly continued. Gould expanded it further, purchasing smaller regional companies and integrating them into the Western Union system. By 1880, his control was so complete that starting a competing telegraph company was essentially impossible. The infrastructure costs were too high, and any new competitor would face rate wars from an entrenched monopoly with resources to sustain losses indefinitely. At home, Helen noticed the increased security. Gould hired additional guards for the Fifth Avenue mansion. He installed locks on the study where he kept business records. He stopped discussing his work entirely, even in the vague terms he had occasionally mentioned before. The children were instructed not to speak about their father's business to anyone, including tutors and household staff. The family was becoming as sealed and controlled as his telegraph network. Helen wrote to her sister in December 1878, "We are quite comfortable but see few people. Jay keeps occupied with his business and I manage the household. The children are well." The letters from this period grow shorter, more formulaic, drained of the small personal details that had appeared in earlier correspondence. She was describing a life that had contracted to its basic functions, empty of anything beyond maintenance and routine. In 1879, Jay Gould attempted to join the Union Club, one of New York's oldest and most prestigious gentlemen's social organizations. His application was submitted through a member who owed him money from a railroad investment. Not a friend exactly, but someone with sufficient financial obligation to provide the required sponsorship. The application included the standard documentation, evidence of financial standing, letters of character reference, a brief statement of interest in membership. The blackballing was unanimous. Not a single member of the club's admissions committee voted in favor. This was unusual even for rejected candidates, who typically received at least a few courtesy votes from acquaintances or those who objected to exclusion on principle. Gould received none. The rejection was delivered by letter, with no explanation beyond the standard notification that his application had not been accepted. He applied to the Manhattan Club the following year. Same result. Then the New York Yacht Club, despite owning a substantial steam yacht, called the Atalanta that he rarely used, rejected again. The Union League Club, the Century Association, the Metropolitan Club. Each application was sponsored by someone with financial ties to Gould. Each was considered, and each was rejected with the same unanimous finality. The blackballing extended beyond formal clubs. Churches where wealthy New Yorkers worshipped made it clear his attendance would be uncomfortable. When Helen expressed interest in joining charitable committees at her Episcopal parish, she was told the positions were filled, though new members were added the following month. Invitations to charity balls, museum exhibitions, and opera performances, events where wealthy donors were typically welcomed regardless of personal reputation, did not arrive at the Gould residence. This was not mere snobbery. It was systematic exclusion, maintained through unwritten but rigorously enforced social codes. The men who rejected Gould from their clubs did business with him when necessary. They negotiated contracts, settled disputes, and sometimes partnered on investments where his capital was useful. But they would not sit with him at dinner. They would not introduce him to their families. They would not allow their wives to acknowledge Helen in public settings. The distinction was crucial. Gould was not being excluded from business. He was too powerful for that. He was being excluded from society, from the social structures that transformed wealth into respectability and business success into family legacy. His money was acceptable. His presence was not. The children absorbed this reality gradually. George, the eldest, attended a private tutorial academy where sons of wealthy families prepared for university. The other boys were civil to him, but never friendly. He was not invited to their homes. When class assignments required group work, he was the last chosen, accepted only when a teacher insisted. He mentioned this to his father once. Gould told him to focus on his studies and ignore social distractions. George did not raise the subject again. Helen, the eldest daughter, faced worse. Girls from prominent families attended the same music lessons and art instruction. They formed clusters during breaks discussing parties and social events. Helen stood apart, not by choice, but by the silent agreement of the others. When she approached groups, conversations would pause, then redirect to topics that pointedly excluded her. One girl told her directly, "My mother said we shouldn't associate with you." Helen reported this to her mother, who had no answer that would make it hurt less. The younger children, Howard, Anna, and Frank, were kept even more isolated. Gould hired private tutors and eliminated most external activities. The official justification was educational superiority, but the practical effect was quarantine. The children learned languages, mathematics, literature, and music within the mansion's walls, interacting almost exclusively with paid staff who were professionally required to treat them with respect. In 1880, Gould commissioned construction of a country estate in Irvington, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. The property, which he named Lyndhurst, had been designed decades earlier by the architect Alexander Jackson Davis in the Gothic Revival style. Gould purchased it from a previous owner and began extensive renovations. He added a massive greenhouse, expanded the grounds, and installed modern conveniences, including gas lighting and advanced heating systems. The estate was beautiful in a cold, formal way. The Gothic arches and towers created an atmosphere more medieval than American, suggesting a fortified manor rather than a country retreat. Gould spent substantial time there, managing business through the private telegraph line he had installed, working from a study that overlooked the river. Helen preferred the estate to the Fifth Avenue mansion. The isolation felt less oppressive when it was surrounded by landscaped grounds, rather than city streets where social exclusion was visible and constant. But even at Lyndhurst, the rejection followed them. Neighboring estates were owned by families who had established themselves in the Hudson Valley for generations. They did not call on the Goulds. They did not extend invitations to local gatherings. When the Goulds attended the nearby Episcopal church, other families sat in different pews and left without speaking. The geographical distance from New York City had not created any social distance from New York judgment. In June 1881, Helen Miller Gould died. She was 41 years old. The cause was listed as tuberculosis, though her declining health over the previous years suggested a longer deterioration than the diagnosis implied. She had been confined to bed for months, attended by private physicians who could do little beyond managing pain. Gould was at her bedside when she died, one of the few moments when business did not take priority. The funeral was small. Family members attended. A few business associates appeared out of professional courtesy. No representatives from New York society came to pay respects. The absence was conspicuous enough that newspapers noted it in their coverage of the funeral, observing that, despite the family's considerable wealth, attendance was limited to immediate relations. The phrasing was delicate, but the implication was clear. Helen had been as excluded in death as she had been in life. Gould showed no visible grief at the funeral. Observers described him as composed, dry-eyed, focused on managing the logistics of the service. Whether this reflected genuine emotional detachment or simply his habitual suppression of feeling cannot be determined. He returned to work within days. The children were left with nurses and tutors while he attended to railroad business and telegraph operations. He did not remarry. For the remaining 11 years of his life, he lived as a widower, managing his household through hired staff, raising his children through structured routines and financial provision rather than emotional presence. The mansion on Fifth Avenue grew quieter. The estate at Lyndhurst became his primary residence, a place where isolation was environmental rather than social, where exclusion could be framed as preference. By 1882, Gould controlled approximately 10,000 miles of railroad track across the American Southwest and Midwest. The network included the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, the International and Great Northern, and the Wabash lines, among smaller acquisitions. This was not an empire built through engineering innovation or improved service. It was constructed through stock manipulation, strategic bankruptcies, and the systematic suppression of labor costs. The Missouri Pacific had been failing when Gould acquired control in 1879. The railroad's infrastructure was deteriorating, its debt overwhelming, and its stock price collapsed. Gould restructured the debt by forcing bondholders to accept reduced payments, threatening bankruptcy if they refused. Once he had eliminated the debt burden at a fraction of its face value, he increased freight rates and cut operating expenses. The railroad became profitable within 2 years, but the profit came entirely from extraction rather than improvement. Operating expenses meant wages. In 1883, Gould cut worker pay by 10% across the Missouri Pacific system. The reduction was announced without negotiation or warning. Men who had been earning $2 per day for track maintenance now earned $1.80. Brakemen, who performed dangerous work coupling and uncoupling rail cars, saw their monthly pay reduced from $50 to $45. The cuts applied uniformly, regardless of tenure or performance. The workers had families. The reduction meant less food, delayed rent. Children pulled from school to work. In small railroad towns where the Missouri Pacific was the primary employer, the wage cut rippled through entire communities. Local businesses that depended on railroad workers' spending saw revenue decline. The economic compression was immediate and measurable. In March 1885, the workers struck. The walkout began with track workers on the Wabash line and spread rapidly across Gould's southwestern network. Thousands of men stopped working, leaving trains idle and freight undelivered. The strike was organized by the Knights of Labor, one of the era's largest labor organizations, and its demands were specific: restore the wage cuts, recognize the union, and improve safety conditions that had resulted in multiple deaths the previous year. Gould's response was calculated. He hired replacement workers at even lower wages than the strikers had been earning. Many of these replacements were men desperate enough to cross picket lines, recent immigrants, unemployed laborers from cities, anyone willing to work for whatever was offered. The replacements were inexperienced, which made operations less efficient and more dangerous, but they were cheaper, which was what mattered. Violence followed. Strikers blocked tracks to prevent replacement workers from operating trains. Replacement workers, protected by hired security, forced their way through. In several locations, the confrontations turned physical. In East St. Louis, strikers overturned a locomotive and set fire to a freight car. In Sedalia, Missouri, armed guards shot into a crowd of strikers, wounding 3 men. In Parsons, Kansas, a replacement brakeman fell between cars and was crushed to death, an accident that would likely not have occurred with experienced workers. The newspapers covered the strike extensively, and the coverage revealed a pattern. Pro-business papers described the strikers as violent mobs threatening commerce and public order. Labor-sympathetic papers described the railroad's tactics as deliberate provocation designed to break the union through attrition and violence. Gould made no public statements. He conducted the railroad's response through intermediaries. managers who announced policies, lawyers who sought injunctions, security contractors who hired the armed guards. The strike lasted several weeks before collapsing. The Knights of Labor, facing financial exhaustion and unable to stop replacement operations, called off the walkout. The workers returned under the reduced wages with no concessions gained. Several strike leaders were fired and blacklisted from railroad employment across the region. The union's defeat was comprehensive. Gould had won, but the victory clarified something about his methods that many had suspected, but could now observe directly. He was willing to accept operational chaos, public disorder, and worker death rather than negotiate or compromise on wage costs. The calculation was purely financial. Strikers and replacements were interchangeable inputs in a system optimized for cost reduction. Their safety, their families, their communities. These were externalities that did not appear in the profit ledger. In 1886, another strike erupted, this time beginning on the Texas and Pacific line. The immediate cause was the firing of a union member for attending a labor meeting. The broader cause was accumulated grievance over wages, hours, and conditions that had worsened under Gould's ownership. This strike was larger and more coordinated. At its peak, over 200,000 workers across multiple railroads walked off the job in sympathy. The strike paralyzed freight movement across the Southwest. Cattle shipments from Texas rotted in holding pens. Grain sat immobile in Kansas warehouses. Coal mines in Missouri reduced operations because they couldn't ship their product. The economic disruption was severe enough that governors from multiple states requested federal intervention. Gould waited. He made no offers, proposed no negotiations, gave no indication of willingness to discuss terms. His railroad executives announced that the companies would not recognize unions under any circumstances and would replace any worker who refused to return. The strategy was the same as before: outlast the workers' financial resources, then resume operations with whoever remained. This strike also collapsed, broken by economic necessity and legal injunctions that prohibited strikers from interfering with interstate commerce. The workers returned defeated. Wages remained suppressed. Union organization was systematically prevented through blacklisting and discharge. The conditions that had triggered the strike continued unchanged. Between 1883 and 1890, at least 37 workers died in accidents on Gould-controlled railroads. The number is conservative, based on incidents reported in newspapers and company records that Gould's managers were legally required to file. The actual number was likely higher. The deaths resulted from coupling accidents, derailments, collisions, and falls, incidents that increased in frequency as Gould deferred maintenance spending and operated with minimally trained replacement workers. No significant safety improvements were implemented. Automatic coupling devices, which would have prevented many of the deaths, were available but costly. Air brakes, which would have reduced collisions, were optional equipment that Gould's lines installed slowly and incompletely. The technology existed to make railroad work safer, but implementing it would have reduced short-term profits, and short-term profits determined operating decisions. At Lyndhurst, Gould spent his evenings reviewing financial statements from the railroad properties. His children rarely saw him except at breakfast. His eldest son, George, now in his late teens, had begun to understand what his father actually did. In a letter to a cousin, George wrote, "Father works very hard and manages extensive responsibilities. The railroads require constant attention." The language was careful, probably shaped by awareness that letters might be read by others, but the avoidance of detail was telling. In the spring of 1888, Jay Gould began coughing. The cough was dry at first, a minor irritation that he ignored while continuing his usual schedule of meetings, correspondence, and market monitoring. By summer, it had worsened. He coughed during breakfast, during business conferences, during the rare moments he spent with his children. The coughing fits left him exhausted, bent over his desk, waiting for breath to return. His private physician examined him in July. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed Helen 7 years earlier. The infection had established itself in his lungs and was progressing. Treatment options were limited. The physician recommended rest, fresh air, and reduced activity, the standard prescriptions for an illness that medicine could slow but not cure. Gould did not rest. He continued working from Lyndhurst, receiving business associates, monitoring telegraph reports of market movements and managing his railroad properties through correspondence and proxy. The only concession he made was to stop traveling to the Manhattan office daily, conducting most business from his estate study instead. The coughing continued. His weight began dropping. By autumn, his suits hung loose on a frame that had always been thin, but was now becoming skeletal. The newspapers reported his illness without sympathy. The New York World ran a brief notice in its business section stating that Jay Gould is said to be unwell with pulmonary trouble. The tone was clinical, almost anticipatory. The Chicago Tribune published an editorial discussing who might acquire his railroad properties after his death, analyzing the question as a matter of market mechanics rather than human mortality. No major paper expressed hope for his recovery or acknowledged the suffering involved in slow death from tuberculosis. When other prominent businessmen fell ill, the public response was different. Cornelius Vanderbilt's final illness had generated sympathetic coverage and expressions of respect for his contributions to transportation infrastructure. J.P. Morgan's health troubles prompted concern about market stability and well wishes for his recovery. But Gould's illness was treated as a business development, notable only for its potential impact on railroad stock prices. The contrast was not lost on him. In a rare moment of candor, he mentioned to his lawyer that he had noticed the newspapers seemed more interested in his property distribution than his health. The lawyer, unsure how to respond to something that was true, but impolitic to acknowledge, said nothing. Gould did not raise the subject again. His children reacted to the illness with varying degrees of engagement. George, now 21 and being groomed to manage the family's business interests, visited his father's study regularly to receive instruction on railroad operations and investment strategy. These sessions were tutorial rather than emotional. Gould was transferring knowledge, ensuring someone could maintain the empire after his death. Edwin, the second son, showed less interest in business and visited less frequently. The younger children were kept away from their father during his worse episodes, presumably to shield them from the visible deterioration. Anna, the younger daughter, wrote in her diary about hearing her father coughing through the night. She was 16 years old and had known him primarily as a distant figure who provided material comfort, but little personal connection. Now he was dying in rooms down the hall, and she had no framework for relating to him beyond the formal politeness that had always characterized their interactions. She wanted to feel something, grief, fear, compassion, but found herself mostly confused about what was expected of her. Gould tried various treatments. He consulted specialists in New York and Philadelphia. He traveled to the Adirondacks for mountain air, which was believed to benefit tuberculosis patients. He spent time on his yacht, thinking ocean air might help where mountain air had not. Nothing slowed the disease's progression. The coughing worsened. He began experiencing night sweats and occasional hemorrhaging. His energy declined to the point where even reading financial reports exhausted him. In the fall of 1889, he made one of his last trips to Manhattan, attending a meeting about a proposed railroad consolidation. Associates who saw him were shocked by his appearance. He was gaunt, pale, his skin pulled tight across his face. He spoke quietly, conserving breath, and had to pause several times during the meeting to control coughing. One attendee later described him as looking already dead, animated only by determination to settle business affairs. The deterioration continued through 1890 and 1891. Gould spent most of his time at Lyndhurst, confined increasingly to his bedroom and study. He could no longer tolerate the Manhattan mansion's winter climate. Business was managed through written correspondence and occasional visits from executives who came to the estate. His railroad empire continued operating, profits flowing upward, labor suppression continuing, all the mechanisms he had established running without requiring his direct presence. During this period, churches that had excluded him while he was healthy did not suddenly extend pastoral care now that he was dying. No ministers arrived at Lyndhurst offering spiritual comfort. No charitable organizations that had rejected his donations earlier softened their positions. The social quarantine remained absolute even as death approached. There was one exception. A Presbyterian minister from Irvington, a man who had not been part of New York's elite social circles and therefore had less to lose by association, began visiting Gould occasionally. They discussed religion in abstract terms. Gould expressed no dramatic deathbed conversion, No sudden repentance, no request for forgiveness. The minister later said that Gould seemed intellectually curious about theological questions, but emotionally disconnected from them, approaching salvation the way he might approach a business proposition, analytically, looking for mechanisms and terms. By late 1891, Gould was bedridden most days. He could no longer work beyond signing documents that staff brought to his room. The coughing was constant. Morphine was administered to manage pain, though it left him foggy and unable to focus. He was 55 years old and had been dying for more than 3 years, the tuberculosis consuming him slowly enough that he experienced every stage of decline. His children visited but found little to say. The emotional distance that had characterized their entire relationship could not be bridged now by shared acknowledgement of approaching death. They stood by his bedside, asked if he needed anything, and left when the silence became too uncomfortable. George continued receiving business instructions until his father became too weak to give them. The others simply maintained presence, fulfilling filial duty without emotional content. In the final weeks, as Gould's consciousness began fragmenting from morphine and organ failure, he occasionally spoke about the telegraph network, about railroad routes, about stock positions that needed monitoring. Even at the edge of death, his mind returned to the systems he had built and controlled. There were no reflections on family, no expressions of regret or affection, no last words of wisdom for his children. Just fragments of business concerns trailing off into confused silence. Even as his own body failed, Gould maintained rigid control over his children's futures. He had accumulated approximately $75 million by 1890, one of the largest fortunes in America, and he approached its distribution with the same calculating precision he applied to railroad acquisitions. The children were not heirs who would inherit freedom. They were the next generation of wealth management, and their lives would be structured accordingly. George, as the eldest son, received the most attention and the heaviest burden. Throughout the late 1880s, while Gould's health declined, he subjected George to intensive business education. The young man sat through hours of explanation about railroad financing, stock manipulation techniques, and the importance of controlling information flows. Gould was not teaching his son how to build businesses, but how to maintain the empire already constructed. The instruction was technical, devoid of ethical framework, focused purely on preservation of capital and power. George absorbed the lessons with visible reluctance. In letters to friends, he wrote about feeling trapped by expectations he had never chosen. He was interested in literature and history, subjects his father considered wasteful distractions from the serious work of wealth management. George read novels in private, hiding them when his father's staff approached, a grown man concealing intellectual interests like contraband. In 1889, Gould arranged George's marriage. The bride was Edith Kingdon, an actress, a choice that surprised New York society given their general contempt for theatrical professions. But the selection was calculated. Kingdon was beautiful, well-spoken, and notably not from an established society family that might reject association with the Gould name. She had no social position to protect and therefore no reason to resist the marriage. Gould offered financial security in exchange for her availability as George's wife. George went along with the arrangement. Whether he had affection for Kingdon or simply accepted his father's choice is unclear from surviving records. The wedding took place at Lyndhurst with minimal attendance. No society figures came. The marriage was announced in newspapers as a business transaction, with more attention given to the financial settlement than to the couple themselves. Edwin, the second son, received different treatment. He was quieter than George, less obviously capable of managing complex business operations. Gould assessed him as unsuited for primary responsibility over the family empire and assigned him secondary roles: board positions in smaller companies, oversight of specific properties, tasks that required presence but not strategic thinking. Edwin seemed relieved by the diminished expectations. He married Helen Miller from a merchant family in a small ceremony that Gould attended despite his advancing illness. The daughters faced narrower constraints. Helen, the eldest daughter, showed intelligence and interest in the family's business operations. She asked questions about railroad management and telegraph investments. Gould discouraged this. He believed business was inappropriate for women and that Helen's curiosity was unwomanly and potentially dangerous to her marriage prospects. When she persisted in asking questions, he simply stopped answering. Helen's marriage was arranged with even more calculation than George's. In 1891, Gould selected Finley Shepard, a lawyer who had worked on railroad contracts. Shepard was competent, professional, and notably willing to sign extensive prenuptial agreements that ensured Helen's inheritance remained under trust control even after marriage. The arrangement protected the fortune from Shepard's potential mismanagement, while simultaneously making clear that Helen would have no independent authority over her own wealth. Helen protested. In a letter to her aunt, she wrote that she barely knew Shepard and had no affection for him. The marriage felt like an assignment to a position rather than a union of choice. Her aunt's response, if any, has not survived. What is certain is that the protest made no difference. The wedding proceeded on schedule in November 1891, with Gould attending from a wheelchair, too weak to stand for the ceremony. Anna and Frank, the youngest children, were still in their teens while their father was dying. Gould made provisions for their futures through trust arrangements that would control their inheritances until they reached ages he specified: 25 for Anna, 30 for Frank. The trusts were structured to prevent impulsive spending and protect the capital from what Gould viewed as the inevitable poor judgment of young people with sudden wealth, but the trusts also ensured continued control after his death. The trustees were men Gould had selected, lawyers and business associates who would manage the money according to his instructions, even when he was no longer alive to enforce them. Anna and Frank would be wealthy, but not free. Their father's hand would guide their financial lives from beyond death. The control extended beyond money into social positioning. Gould explicitly instructed his children to maintain distance from New York society, which had rejected the family. He told them that seeking acceptance from people who had despised him would be degrading and futile. They should build their own circles, associate with those who had no choice but to accept Gould money, and never lower themselves by pursuing social recognition from families that had excluded them. This instruction created a paradox. The children had been isolated their entire lives specifically because of their father's reputation. They had no established social connections, no friendship networks outside the family, no organic community they could call their own. Gould was now telling them to build alternative circles, but he had never taught them how to form genuine relationships. They had been raised in transactional frameworks where everything, marriages, business partnerships, social interactions, was arranged through calculation rather than authentic connection. Howard, the middle son, was perhaps most damaged by this approach. He was temperamentally gentle, unsuited for the aggressive business tactics his father valued. Gould pushed him toward railroad management anyway, assigning him positions in subsidiary companies and expecting performance that Howard could not deliver. The young man began drinking heavily in his early 20s, a problem that would worsen after his father's death. In early 1892, with Gould bedridden and barely conscious most days, he made final modifications to his will. The document was extraordinarily detailed, specifying not just how money would be distributed, but how it should be managed, what investments were permitted, and which trustees had authority over different portions of the estate. The will was less a transfer of wealth than an extension of control, ensuring his methods and priorities would continue governing family decisions even after his death. His children gathered at Lyndhurst as the final weeks approached. They sat with him in shifts, maintaining presence in the sick room because duty required it, not because the dying man had cultivated relationships that made them want to be there. Gould drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing them, sometimes not. When lucid, he occasionally gave additional business instructions or made small modifications to trust arrangements. There were no expressions of love, no apologies for the isolation he had imposed, no acknowledgement of the burden he was leaving them. In 1890, as tuberculosis tightened its grip, Gould began making charitable donations. The timing was not coincidental. Faced with approaching death and a legacy defined entirely by market manipulation and labor suppression, he appeared to be attempting what other wealthy men had achieved: transformation of reputation through strategic generosity. The donations were substantial by most measures, but modest relative to his fortune. He gave $50,000 to New York University for a library building, $25,000 to the Presbyterian Hospital, $15,000 to a home for aged women, $10,000 to various orphanages and relief societies. The contributions were announced publicly, processed through lawyers who ensured newspapers received notice of Gould's generosity. The institutions accepted the money but made their discomfort clear. New York University delayed publicly acknowledging the library donation for several months. When they finally did, the announcement was brief and procedural, lacking the effusive gratitude typically extended to major donors. The library building, when completed, carried no prominent naming recognition. A small plaque inside acknowledged Gould's contribution among several other donors, his name listed without special distinction. The Presbyterian Hospital's response was more direct. The board accepted the donation, but issued a statement emphasizing that acceptance should not be interpreted as endorsement of the donor's business practices. The phrasing was carefully diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. They would take Gould's money while maintaining moral distance from how it had been acquired. This pattern repeated across his charitable efforts. Organizations needed funding, and Gould had an enormous surplus, but they refused to grant him the redemption he seemed to be purchasing. The money was processed as if contaminated, accepted because practical necessity outweighed moral qualms, but never with the warmth or public gratitude that might suggest forgiveness. Gould appeared genuinely confused by the reception. He had observed other wealthy men, Vanderbilt, Astor, even the Rockefellers, who were beginning their own philanthropic initiatives, receive praise for charitable giving. Their donations earned them public recognition, honorary positions on institutional boards, and softened criticism of their business methods. Gould had followed the same formula. He had given money to worthy causes. He had made the donations public. He had expected the standard transaction, wealth converted into respectability through charitable distribution. But the transaction did not work for him. The difference, which Gould seemed unable to grasp, was that other wealthy men had committed their offenses at greater distance. Vanderbilt's labor practices were harsh, but not unusually so for his era. Rockefeller's monopolistic tactics were ruthless, but executed through corporate mechanisms that obscured direct visibility. Their wealth could be separated from their methods through sufficient time and institutional buffering. Gould's offenses were too recent, too visible, and too personal. The Erie War was not ancient history, but a scandal from 2 decades prior that people vividly remembered. Black Friday had destroyed thousands of families, many of whom were still living with the consequences. The railroad strikes had occurred within the past 5 years. Workers who had been shot at by guards Gould hired were still alive, still telling their stories. The harm was too fresh and too direct to be erased by university library donations. Religious institutions proved particularly resistant. Gould donated to several churches, including a significant contribution to the Reformed Church in Irvington near Lyndhurst. The church accepted the money, but several prominent members resigned from the congregation in protest, stating they could not worship in a building funded by Gould's wealth. The minister who had visited Gould during his illness defended the donation, arguing that churches should welcome repentant sinners. But the minister never claimed Gould was actually repentant, only that churches should be open to the possibility. In one instance, Gould's donation was rejected outright. He offered $30,000 to a children's hospital in Manhattan, proposing that a wing be named in Helen's memory. The hospital's board deliberated for 3 weeks before declining, stating that, given the circumstances of the donor's public reputation, the board believes acceptance would harm the institution's standing with other benefactors. They returned the money. The rejection stung visibly. Gould had expected many things throughout his career: hatred, condemnation, legal challenges. But he had not expected that his money itself would be turned away. Money had always been the ultimate argument, the mechanism that overcome obstacles and opened doors. That a hospital would refuse desperately needed funds rather than associate with him suggested a level of social contamination he had not fully understood he carried. He responded by creating his own charitable vehicle, a trust that would distribute funds after his death according to specifications he controlled. This approach avoided the immediate rejection. Organizations could accept money without knowing its source until after Gould was dead, at which point protest would be more difficult. The trust was methodical and calculated, treating charity as he treated railroad acquisitions, as a technical problem requiring structured solutions. But even this mechanism revealed misunderstanding about what philanthropy was supposed to accomplish. Other wealthy men used charity to build relationships, join boards, interact with civic leaders in contexts that normalized their presence and softened their reputations over time. Gould's posthumous trust eliminated that possibility. He would be dead when the money was distributed. There would be no opportunity for gradual rehabilitation, no chance to be seen doing good works, no accumulation of positive associations that might balance the negative. His children watched these failed philanthropic attempts with varying degrees of awareness. George understood what his father was trying to accomplish and why it was not working. In a conversation with Edwin, he observed that their father seemed to believe reputation could be purchased like stock, but that society operated on different mechanisms than markets did. Edwin asked if they should explain this to their father. George said no, it would not change anything. Anna kept a diary during this period, and several entries discuss her father's donations. She wrote that she wished the money could make people see him differently, but knew it would not. She was 17 years old and already understood something her father, after decades in business, could not grasp, that certain kinds of damage could not be repaired through financial transactions. The philanthropy continued through 1891 as Gould's health deteriorated further. Each donation was announced. Each was accepted with visible reluctance or rejected outright. No major institution offered him an honorary position. No civic organization invited him to join. No newspaper editorial softened its assessment of his character because he had funded a hospital ward. In November 1891, bedridden and struggling to breathe, Gould dictated a letter to the trustees who would manage his posthumous charitable trust. The letter instructed them to continue making donations to worthwhile causes, but included a curious addition. The trustees should not publicize his name in connection with the gifts unless specifically required. If anonymity was possible, they should maintain it. By January 1892, Jay Gould could no longer leave his bedroom at Lyndhurst. The tuberculosis had progressed to the point where even sitting upright required assistance. His weight had dropped below 100 pounds. The coughing fits came so frequently that sustained conversation was impossible. Morphine was administered regularly, blurring the boundaries between consciousness and sleep, between present circumstances and confused memories. The empire he had built continued operating without him. Railroads ran on schedules he had established. Telegraph messages crossed networks he controlled. Stock prices fluctuated based on market forces he had once manipulated but could no longer monitor. His absence made no operational difference. The systems were sufficiently institutionalized that they functioned independently of the man who had created them. George handled day-to-day business decisions, traveling between Lyndhurst and the Manhattan office, bringing documents that required his father's signature. Gould would sign when conscious enough to hold a pen, often without reading what he was approving. The signatures grew increasingly illegible, shaky marks that barely resembled his former precise handwriting. George wondered if these documents would hold up legally and decided not to raise the question. His father's authority was ebbing, and there was no point accelerating the transition. The household at Lyndhurst operated in a state of suspended waiting. Servants maintained routines, meals prepared, rooms cleaned, grounds kept, but the atmosphere was that of an institution winding down rather than a living home. The children came and went. They sat with their father when duty required. They retreated to other parts of the estate when they could justify absence. No one knew what to do with a dying man they had never known as anything but distant and controlling. Edwin visited less frequently than George. He claimed business obligations kept him in the city, but the obligations were minimal, invented excuses to avoid the sick room. Edwin had spent his entire life unable to meet his father's expectations and had internalized that failure as personal inadequacy. Now, watching his father deteriorate, he felt something close to relief mixed with guilt about feeling relief. He could not articulate this to anyone, so he simply stayed away. Helen Shepherd, recently married, divided time between her new household and Lyndhurst. Her husband Finley rarely accompanied her. He had married into the family for financial security and social positioning, such as it was, but saw no reason to maintain pretense of affection for a dying man he barely knew. Helen sat with her father in silence, occasionally reading aloud from newspapers when he was alert enough to follow. She never knew if he actually heard her. He gave no indication either way. The few business associates who still visited came out of professional necessity rather than personal connection. They needed decisions on pending matters, signatures on contracts, clarification on instructions that only Gould could provide. They were escorted to his bedroom, conducted their business efficiently, and left as quickly as politeness permitted. No one lingered. No one engaged in reminiscence or shared memories of better times. There were no better times to remember. The social isolation that had defined Gould's life intensified in its final months. No former colleagues stopped by to pay respects. No civic leaders came to acknowledge his contributions to American infrastructure. No ministers arrived offering spiritual comfort beyond the single Presbyterian pastor from Irvington, who continued occasional visits out of professional duty. The pastor later described these final meetings in his journal. Gould would sometimes ask theological questions, but always in analytical terms, treating salvation as a contractual arrangement rather than spiritual transformation. He wanted to know the mechanics. What specific beliefs were required? What actions constituted sufficient repentance? Could past wrongs be balanced by future good? The pastor tried to explain that faith was not a transaction, but Gould seemed unable to conceive of any relationship in non-transactional terms. In March 1892, Gould experienced several episodes of hemorrhaging, coughing up blood in quantities that alarmed even the experienced physicians attending him. They increased the morphine dosage, prioritizing comfort over consciousness. He spent most of his final weeks in a fog, occasionally surfacing to brief awareness, before sliding back into confused semi-consciousness. During one of these lucid moments, he asked George about stock positions in Western Union. George provided numbers. Gould nodded, seemed to calculate something internally, then lost focus before completing whatever thought had begun. George stayed in the room for another hour, but his father did not regain clarity. It was one of their final conversations, and it had been about stock prices. Anna wrote in her diary about visiting her father's room and finding him staring at the ceiling, breathing in shallow gasps, apparently unaware of her presence. She sat for a while, then left when the nurse indicated he needed rest. She had wanted to say something meaningful, but could not identify what that might be. They had never had meaningful conversations when he was healthy. Death was not going to create sudden intimacy. Howard, the middle son, struggled more visibly than his siblings. He was 22 years old and had been drinking heavily for 2 years, numbing himself against expectations he could not meet, and a family dynamic he could not escape. He visited his father drunk on at least one occasion, slurring words while trying to maintain composure. Gould, briefly conscious, looked at him without recognition. Whether this was due to morphine fog or genuine failure to identify his own son was unclear. Howard left the room and was found later that evening by servants, passed out in the estate's greenhouse. The doctors maintained a death watch in shifts. This was standard practice for wealthy patients in terminal decline, medical staff present to manage pain and notify family when the end approached. But the vigil at Lyndhurst was remarkable for its emotional emptiness. No one was keeping watch because they desperately wanted to be present for final moments with someone they loved. They were waiting because protocol required it, because inheritance procedures needed medical certification of death, because legal and financial mechanisms required official documentation. In late November, Gould's periods of consciousness became rarer. He would occasionally open his eyes, but showed no recognition of where he was or who surrounded him. His breathing grew increasingly labored. The physicians indicated the end was approaching within days rather than weeks. The family gathered, not out of grief, but because absence would have been conspicuous. They waited in separate rooms, coming to the sick room in shifts, maintaining presence while avoiding prolonged exposure to their father's final deterioration. No one held his hand. No one spoke words of comfort or farewell. He was alone in the crowd, dying surrounded by people bound to him by blood and money, but nothing resembling affection. Jay Gould died on December 2, 1892, at 9:15 in the morning. The physician attending him noted the time in clinical language: cessation of respiratory function following prolonged tubercular infection. The death was not sudden. He had been fading for hours, his breathing becoming shallower and more irregular, until it finally stopped. George was in the room when it happened. The other children were downstairs and were summoned after the fact. There was no deathbed scene, no final words, no moment of reconciliation or clarity. Gould had been unconscious for nearly 2 days before the end. His last lucid statement, given 3 days earlier to his nurse, had been a question about whether documents had been sent to his lawyer. Even at the threshold of death, His mind had circled back to administrative details and legal procedures. The immediate response at Lyndhurst was procedural. The physician completed his documentation. Staff were notified. Telegrams were sent to relatives and business associates. The body was prepared for viewing, dressed in a dark suit, positioned in the drawing room with appropriate mourning arrangements. Everything was done according to established protocol for a man of wealth and position, but the atmosphere was one of task completion rather than grief. The children's reactions were muted and complicated. George felt primarily relief that the prolonged dying was finished, followed immediately by anxiety about the responsibilities now fully his. Edwin experienced something close to numbness. His father had been a distant, demanding presence, and his absence did not create a void so much as remove a source of pressure. Helen cried, though when questioned later she could not articulate what she was crying for. Anna wrote in her diary that she felt she should feel more than she did. The funeral was held 4 days later at the Reformed Church in Irvington. Attendance was sparse for a man of Gould's wealth. Family members filled the first rows. Some business associates attended, men who had worked with Gould and needed to maintain appearance of respect, regardless of personal feelings. Railroad executives who now reported to George rather than his father. Lawyers and accountants who managed the estate. Notably absent were representatives from New York's established families, from social organizations, from civic institutions. The mayor did not attend. No prominent clergymen participated beyond the local pastor who conducted the service. The funeral of one of America's wealthiest men drew fewer than 100 people, most of them present for professional rather than personal reasons. The newspapers had been waiting for this death. Coverage began within hours of the announcement. The New York World published a front-page obituary under the headline, "Jay Gould, Dead. The Wizard of Wall Street Succumbs to Consumption." The article recounted his career in detail: the Erie War, Black Friday, the telegraph monopoly, the railroad empire, with particular emphasis on the scandals and manipulations. The writing was technically factual but arranged to create maximum negative impact. The World's editorial page was less restrained. Jay Gould is dead, and the business world sighs with relief. No man in American history has done more to corrupt the mechanisms of commerce or brought more suffering through the relentless pursuit of personal gain. His death removes from our midst a man whose entire career was a sustained assault on honest enterprise and fair dealing. Other papers followed similar approaches. The New York Times described Gould as the most hated man in America and suggested that his passing will be mourned by none save those who profited from association with his schemes. The Chicago Tribune published a cartoon showing Gould at the gates of hell, being welcomed by a devil who says, "We've been expecting you." The imagery was crude but reflected genuine public sentiment. Harper's Weekly ran an extensive retrospective on Gould's career, documenting each major scandal with particular attention to the human costs. The article included testimonials from workers who had suffered under his railroad management, investors who had been ruined by his stock manipulations, and businesses that had collapsed during his market corners. The cumulative effect was damning. Gould was presented not as a complex figure with positive and negative aspects, but as an almost purely destructive force. The responses were not entirely negative. Some business publications acknowledged his financial acumen and strategic thinking. The Commercial and Financial Chronicle noted that, whatever moral judgments may be applied to his methods, Jay Gould possessed exceptional ability in understanding market mechanisms and corporate structure. But even these relatively neutral assessments were careful to maintain distance, praising technical skill while avoiding endorsement of the man himself. The most striking responses were those that explicitly celebrated his death. Labor newspapers published editorials with titles like "Good Riddance" and "Justice at Last." The Railroad Trainmen's Journal wrote that, "The earth is lightened by the removal of Jay Gould, whose weight upon it was composed entirely of stolen wealth and broken lives." A union leader in Kansas gave a speech at a workers' rally, stating that, "Gould's death proves that even money cannot purchase immortality, and that God eventually settles accounts." These responses were not fringe opinions, but mainstream reactions published in widely circulated papers and echoed in public discussions. The relief at Gould's death was expressed openly, without the usual social prohibition against speaking ill of the deceased. The standard protocols of postmortem respect did not apply. People felt free to say what they had always thought, and what they thought was that the world was better without him. At Lyndhurst, the family read these responses with varying degrees of shock. They had known their father was hated, but seeing the hatred expressed so publicly and comprehensively was different than vaguely understanding it existed. Helen Shepherd became nearly hysterical after reading several of the editorials, crying that people were being cruel and unfair. George told her not to read the newspapers. She ignored this advice and continued reading, as if compelled to understand the full scope of how their father was perceived. The estate settlement began immediately. Gould's will was filed with the surrogate court in New York. The total value of the estate was calculated at approximately $72 million. The exact figure was disputed and would take years to settle completely, making it one of the largest in American history. The distribution followed the detailed instructions Gould had specified. George received the largest share and primary control. The other children received substantial inheritances, but under trust arrangements that limited their autonomy. The provisions for charitable distribution were minimal, far smaller than the fortunes being dedicated to philanthropy by other wealthy families. The will reading was attended by family, lawyers, and trustees. The atmosphere was businesslike, focused on procedures and distributions. No one expressed surprise at the arrangements. Gould had discussed them before his death, and everything proceeded according to his documented wishes. What struck several attendees was how little warmth or personal sentiment appeared in the document. It read like a corporate restructuring plan rather than a father's final wishes for his children. Within 2 years of their father's death, the Gould children began attempting to distance themselves from what he had been. The strategies varied, but the underlying motivation was consistent. The name carried too much contamination to be worn without consequence, and wealth alone could not overcome the social exclusion they inherited. George tried first through business rehabilitation. He took control of the railroad and telegraph properties with genuine intention to operate them differently. He increased worker wages modestly on the Missouri Pacific Line. He improved safety conditions and installed automatic coupling devices his father had refused to purchase. He negotiated with labor representatives rather than simply hiring replacement workers during disputes. These were real changes, implemented at real cost. But the changes were interpreted through the lens of his name. When George raised wages, newspapers suggested he was attempting to buy goodwill his father's fortune couldn't purchase. When he improved safety equipment, labor publications noted it was the bare minimum required by decency and decades overdue. When he negotiated with unions, business rivals portrayed it as weakness, a son unable to match his father's ruthlessness. Every positive action was filtered through suspicion that it was performance rather than genuine reform. The social rejection continued unabated. George was still excluded from the clubs that had blackballed his father. His wife Edith, despite her beauty and social skills, was not invited to events organized by established New York families. Their children, Gould's grandchildren, faced the same isolation he had endured. When George's eldest son applied to certain private schools, he was quietly discouraged from completing the application. The contamination was generational. In 1896, George made a substantial donation to New York University, far larger than his father's previous gift, and funded construction of an entire academic building. The university accepted, but again minimized public acknowledgement. The building was named University Hall rather than bearing the Gould name. When George inquired about this decision, he was told diplomatically that the university preferred functional naming. The real reason that the Gould name would harm fundraising from other donors was left unspoken but understood. Edwin took a different approach: withdrawal. He largely removed himself from active business management, taking his inheritance and living quietly. He purchased an estate in Tarrytown, away from Manhattan's social scene, and spent his time collecting art and rare books. The collecting was genuine interest, but also a convenient excuse for isolation. He traveled to Europe regularly, where the Gould name carried less immediate stigma, and developed relationships with dealers and scholars who cared more about his money than his father's reputation. But even in withdrawal, the legacy followed him. European aristocrats who gladly sold him paintings and antiques still did not invite him to their social gatherings. He was a buyer, useful for his wealth, but not someone to be introduced into established circles. Edwin seemed to accept this with resignation. He had spent his life failing to meet his father's expectations, and now he spent it failing to escape his father's shadow. The failure felt familiar, almost comfortable. Helen Shepherd tried perhaps the hardest to create separation. She threw herself into charitable work, serving on boards of hospitals and orphanages, organizing fundraising events, and making substantial personal donations beyond the family trust allocations. The work was genuine. She spent hours visiting patients, planning programs, and managing operations rather than simply lending her name to causes. The charitable community accepted her money and her labor, but kept her at arm's length socially. She was useful for fundraising among nouveau riche donors who lacked the social standing to object to her presence. But she was not invited to the private gatherings where old money families socialized outside official charitable functions. She organized events but was not included in the guest lists of events others organized. In 1899, Helen made an extraordinary gesture. She announced she would fund a hospital wing specifically for treating tuberculosis patients, the disease that had killed both her mother and father. The donation was significant, over $100,000, and the wing would provide free treatment to patients who could not afford care. It was exactly the kind of personal, meaningful philanthropy that often softened reputations. The hospital board debated for 6 weeks before accepting. Several members argued that association with the Gould name, even through the daughter rather than Jay Gould himself, would alienate other donors. The debate became public when a board member opposed to acceptance gave an interview stating that charity cannot wash blood from money. The comment was harsh enough that other board members criticized it, but the underlying sentiment, that Gould money was morally tainted, was widely shared. The wing was eventually built and named the Helen Miller Gould Pavilion, using her full name to emphasize connection to her mother rather than her father. Helen attended the dedication ceremony but was not asked to speak. The mayor gave remarks, several physicians were recognized, and the board president thanked various donors, including Helen, in a list of names. She sat in the audience watching her substantial gift being accepted with minimal acknowledgement. Howard's trajectory was the most visible deterioration. His drinking, which had started in his early 20s, worsened steadily after his father's death. He married Catherine Clemens in 1898, a marriage that seemed motivated more by his need for structure than genuine affection. Catherine tried to manage his drinking but lacked the tools or support to address what was clearly severe alcoholism. Howard's public intoxication became gossip material for newspapers that had previously focused on his father. Stories appeared about him being removed from clubs for disorderly behavior, about arguments with staff at hotels, about Catherine's visible distress at social functions where Howard appeared drunk. The coverage was different from what his father had faced. It was more mocking than hostile, treating Howard as a pathetic figure rather than a dangerous one, but it extended the family's public humiliation into a new generation. Anna, the younger daughter, tried to escape through geography. She married into a family with European connections and spent much of her time abroad, primarily in France. She learned to introduce herself using her married name first, mentioning her birth family only when necessary. In European aristocratic circles, where American industrial fortunes were viewed with general disdain regardless of their source, the specific details of her father's reputation mattered less. She was simply another wealthy American, a category that carried its own set of prejudices, but not the particular isolation she faced in New York. Frank, the youngest son, inherited a substantial portion of the railroad holdings and tried to manage them with reforms similar to George's efforts. He faced the same interpretive problem. Every positive action was viewed as insufficient compensation for their father's legacy rather than as independent merit. In 1895, 3 years after Jay Gould's death, George attempted to sell the Fifth Avenue mansion. The property was valuable, a large corner lot in one of Manhattan's most expensive neighborhoods, well-maintained, fully furnished with expensive fixtures and artwork. He listed it at a reasonable price, well below what equivalent properties were commanding. No buyers emerged. Real estate agents reported that potential purchasers toured the property, admired the construction quality and location, then declined without explanation. When pressed, several agents admitted their clients had concerns about the property's association. One wealthy industrialist who had considered purchasing told his agent directly, "I will not raise my family in Jay Gould's house." The concern was not structural or financial. It was contamination by proximity. George reduced the price twice over the next year. Still no serious offers. The problem was not value, but identity. The mansion was not simply a building, but a physical embodiment of Gould's presence in New York, a reminder of wealth that respectable society had refused to legitimize. Owning it would mean inhabiting that rejection, accepting association with a name that remained toxic years after its owner's death. In 1897, George sold the property at a significant loss to a developer who immediately announced plans to demolish it and construct apartment buildings on the site. The developer made clear in statements to newspapers that the existing structure would be completely removed. Nothing of the original mansion would remain. The land had value. The building did not. The demolition took place in early 1898. Several newspapers covered it, treating the destruction as symbolic closure. The New York World described it as the final erasure of Jay Gould's most visible presence in the city he dominated but never joined. The mansion was reduced to rubble, carted away, replaced by new construction that bore no trace of what had stood there previously. Lyndhurst presented a different problem. The estate was beautiful, sprawling across 67 acres of landscaped grounds with views of the Hudson River. The Gothic Revival mansion was architecturally significant, designed by one of the period's notable architects. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a prestigious country property that wealthy families would compete to own. But it had been Gould's primary residence during his final years. He had died there. The association was inescapable. George tried to maintain it as a family property, but found that none of the Gould children wanted to live there. The estate became a financial burden, requiring staff, maintenance, and upkeep for a property no one occupied except for occasional brief visits. In 1899, George attempted to donate Lyndhurst to the state of New York as a public park or historical property. The offer included the mansion, grounds, and an endowment for maintenance. The state legislature debated the proposal for several months. Multiple legislators argued that accepting property associated with Jay Gould would constitute an implicit endorsement of his legacy. One assemblyman stated on the record that the people of New York should not be expected to memorialize a man who spent his life exploiting them. The donation was declined. The official reason given was budgetary. The state could not afford the ongoing maintenance costs even with the endowment. The actual reason, clear from legislative debate transcripts, was that Gould's name made the property politically toxic. No elected official wanted to be associated with accepting a Gould family gift. George then approached several universities and cultural institutions. New York University, despite having accepted previous donations, declined the estate. Columbia University expressed initial interest but withdrew after alumni objections. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was offered Lyndhurst as a potential satellite location or artist retreat. They declined without serious consideration. The pattern was consistent across every institution George contacted. The property itself was acknowledged as valuable and beautiful. The association with Jay Gould made it unacceptable. Organizations that desperately needed facilities and funding were willing to forego both rather than accept a gift that bore the Gould name prominently. Similar problems emerged with other properties. Gould had owned a yacht, the Atalanta, that had been expensive to build and maintain. George tried to sell it after his father's death. The yacht was well constructed and in good condition, but potential buyers learned it had been Gould's personal vessel and withdrew their interest. One yachting club member who had initially expressed interest explained to the broker, "I cannot sail in Jay Gould's boat without people assuming I share his values." The yacht eventually sold for far below its material value to a buyer who planned to strip it for parts. A summer cottage in the Adirondacks faced the same reception. The property had been used briefly during Gould's illness when doctors recommended mountain air. It was modest by Gould standards, a simple retreat in beautiful surroundings. George offered it at below-market rates to several potential buyers. All declined. The cottage sat vacant for years, gradually deteriorating from lack of maintenance, before finally selling to a buyer who immediately renamed it and removed all evidence of Gould's ownership. The struggle to dispose of these properties revealed something the family had not fully grasped. Their father's contamination was physical, embedded in objects and spaces he had occupied. The wealth could be spent, invested, converted into other forms. But the physical remnants of his life, the buildings he had lived in, the objects he had owned, carried a stigma that could not be separated from their material value. In 1901, Helen attempted a different approach with some of the artwork from Lyndhurst. Gould had accumulated substantial collections, paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, purchased through dealers with more attention to cost than aesthetic judgment. Helen selected several valuable pieces and offered them to museums as donations. She was willing to give them anonymously if necessary, asking only that the museums accept them as worthy art regardless of their previous ownership. Several museums accepted pieces under the condition that their provenance would be documented but not prominently displayed. The paintings would hang in galleries without labels indicating they had been owned by Jay Gould. Other museums declined even under these terms, stating that donor restrictions on provenance disclosure conflicted with their documentation practices. The real concern that Gould Association might harm their fundraising was left unspoken. Lyndhurst remained in family ownership, increasingly neglected as the children focused on other properties and gradually reduced maintenance spending. The estate that had cost enormous sums to build and landscape slowly deteriorated. Gardens grew wild. The greenhouse that Gould had maintained meticulously fell into disrepair. The mansion itself remained structurally sound, but took on the atmosphere of abandonment, a monument to wealth that no one wanted to claim. George wrote in a private letter to Edwin in 1903, "Father built an empire, but could not build a home anyone wishes to inherit. The properties burden us more than benefit us. Everything he touches carries his touch too permanently." In 1901, Andrew Carnegie published an essay titled "The Gospel of Wealth," outlining principles for responsible philanthropy among America's industrial elite. The essay became foundational text for how wealthy men should approach charitable giving and legacy construction. Carnegie described a moral obligation to return fortunes to society through strategic philanthropy, transforming private wealth into public good. The essay mentioned Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and other prominent industrialists. Jay Gould's name did not appear. The omission was not accidental. By the turn of the century, a careful sorting had occurred among the previous generation's industrial titans. Some, Carnegie, Rockefeller, even Vanderbilt posthumously, were being gradually rehabilitated into a narrative of American progress. Their methods were acknowledged as harsh but framed as necessary steps in building national infrastructure and industrial capacity. Their late career philanthropy was accepted as partial redemption. Gould was sorted into a different category. He remained permanently classified as a robber baron in the negative sense, a predator rather than builder, someone whose wealth represented pure extraction without corresponding contribution. This classification became embedded in historical accounts, economic textbooks, and public memory in ways that proved impossible to dislodge. In 1903, Ida Tarbell published her influential investigation of Standard Oil, criticizing Rockefeller's monopolistic practices. The work was damning and helped trigger antitrust legislation. Yet even Tarbell's harsh assessment of Rockefeller maintained a distinction between his methods and Gould's. Rockefeller had built an actual industry, creating infrastructure and employing thousands. Gould, in Tarbell's analysis, had built nothing but paper schemes and stock manipulations. The distinction stuck. Historical accounts from the period consistently place Gould at the bottom of the industrial hierarchy. Charles Francis Adams, Jr., writing about railroad development, described Gould as the most repulsive figure in American business history. Matthew Josephson's 1934 book, The Robber Barons, devoted substantial space to Gould, portraying him as exemplar of everything wrong with Gilded Age capitalism. Even accounts sympathetic to industrial development treated Gould as an exceptional case of pure corruption. The Gould family's attempts to influence this historical narrative failed completely. In 1907, George funded a biography of his father, hiring a professional writer to present a more favorable account. The resulting book was published quietly by a small press and reviewed harshly by major newspapers. The New York Times called it an unconvincing attempt to rehabilitate the irredeemable. Sales were minimal. Libraries did not acquire it. The book disappeared from circulation within years. Meanwhile, Carnegie's autobiography became standard reading, presenting his rise from poverty to wealth as an inspirational American story. Rockefeller's authorized biography, despite his controversial career, was treated as a legitimate historical document. Vanderbilt's descendants successfully promoted narratives of their grandfather as a visionary railroad builder. These rehabilitations were partial and contested, but they represented movement from pure condemnation toward complex assessment. No such movement occurred for Gould. Each new generation of historians examined his career and reached the same conclusions. The Erie War remained straightforward corruption. Black Friday remained indefensible market manipulation. The railroad strikes remained clear cases of labor exploitation. No new evidence emerged to complicate these assessments. No theoretical frameworks developed that might reinterpret his actions more favorably. The historical verdict remained fixed. The contrast was particularly visible in physical memorialization. Carnegie had libraries across the country bearing his name, buildings that people used daily without thinking about his union busting or exploitation. Rockefeller had a university, a foundation, and numerous institutions that had absorbed his donations and converted them into a legitimate legacy. Vanderbilt had a university in Nashville that became a prestigious educational institution, its name associated with the school rather than the railroad baron. Gould had nothing comparable. The buildings funded by his donations either collapsed, were renamed, or carried such minimal acknowledgement that his connection disappeared. New York University's library building that received his funding was demolished in 1894 and rebuilt without any Gould recognition. The Presbyterian Hospital expanded multiple times, erasing the section his donation had funded. No institution wanted to be known as Gould's the way universities proudly identified with Carnegie or Rockefeller. His grandchildren faced this erasure directly. When they attended schools or universities, they sometimes encountered their grandfather's name in history texts as example of 19th century corruption. Teachers used Jay Gould as an illustration of unethical business practices. Economics professors cited Black Friday as a case study in market manipulation. The grandchildren learned about their family history from hostile academic accounts rather than family memory. Some tried to escape through name changes or distance. Several of Gould's great-grandchildren used maternal family names instead of Gould. Others moved abroad permanently, settling in Europe where American industrial history carried less immediate recognition. A few leaned into notoriety, accepting their grandfather's reputation as unchangeable fact and building identities separate from any attempt at redemption. The money, of course, remained. The fortune that Gould had accumulated continued generating returns through investments George and his brothers managed competently, if not brilliantly. The family remained wealthy across generations, but the wealth existed in strange isolation from social legitimacy. They could buy property, fund education, travel extensively, and live comfortably. They could not buy acceptance into the social echelons their wealth should have granted access to. By the 1920s, the original Gould children were elderly or dead. George died in 1923, having spent 3 decades trying to rehabilitate his father's business practices and his family's reputation with minimal success. Edwin died in 1933, having largely withdrawn from public life. Helen died in 1938 after decades of charitable work that earned her personal respect but never fully separated her from her father's legacy. Their efforts to reshape how Jay Gould was remembered had accomplished almost nothing. Historical accounts from the 1930s described him in essentially the same terms as accounts from the 1890s. He remained the archetypal robber baron, the pure predator, the man whose wealth represented everything corrupt about Gilded Age capitalism. Other industrial fortunes had been laundered into respectability through sufficient time, strategic philanthropy, and institutional partnerships. Carnegie's fortune funded libraries that communities loved. Rockefeller's funded medical research that saved lives. Even the darker aspects of their wealth accumulation gradually faded into background, and as the benefits of their philanthropy became visible and immediate. Gould's fortune funded nothing that carried his name with pride. His money had been accepted where necessary, but never embraced, distributed into institutions that took the funds while maintaining maximum distance from their source. The wealth had been sterilized, cleansed of association with the man who accumulated it, spent without acknowledgement or gratitude. In 1945, Lyndhurst was finally donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The donation came from Gould's daughter Anna, one of the last surviving children. The National Trust accepted on the condition that the estate would be interpreted primarily as example of Gothic Revival architecture rather than as Jay Gould's home. His occupancy would be noted in historical materials but not emphasized. The estate would be preserved in spite of his association with it, not because of it. Jay Gould died worth $72 million and left behind 6 children, thousands of miles of railroad track, a communications network that spanned the continent, and a name that no one wanted to inherit. The wealth persisted across generations. The reputation never softened. Other men who built fortunes through similar methods found paths to partial redemption. They timed their philanthropy better, cultivated the right institutional relationships, or simply lived long enough for their offenses to fade into historical abstraction. Gould's crimes remained too visible, too recent, too directly traceable to identifiable victims. The workers he had suppressed, the investors he had ruined, the markets he had manipulated, these were not distant historical events, but living memories when he died, testimonies that survived him. Whether he understood what he had traded for his empire remains unclear. He never wrote reflections on his life or expressed regret in any documented form. His final years were spent managing assets and controlling inheritances, treating his approaching death as another business problem requiring structured solutions. If he felt anything about the social rejection, the hatred, the legacy of isolation he was leaving his children, he never said so in any surviving record. The children spent decades trying to escape what he had been. Some succeeded in building separate identities, others remained trapped by association, but none managed to transform the Gould name into something respectable, to convert the fortune into the kind of social legitimacy their father had been excluded from, and they had inherited exclusion from. Lyndhurst still stands, maintained by the National Trust, visited by tourists interested in architecture rather than the man who lived there. The mansion on Fifth Avenue was demolished and replaced. The railroads were sold and merged into larger systems. The telegraph network evolved into technologies that erased his connection to their origins. The fortune dispersed across descendants who carry the blood but often not the name. What remains is the question Gould never answered, and perhaps never asked: whether wealth accumulated through methods that society found unforgivable could ever purchase what he seemed to want but could never admit to wanting. Not just power, but belonging. Not just success, but acceptance. Not just an empire, but a home. He built the empire. The home never existed.